They say the fall of Anne Boleyn was the greatest scandal of the Tudor age. But hidden behind the Queen's beheading, behind the screams, the swords, the accusations of adultery and treason, there was another death, a quieter one, a death so brutal, so politically calculated that history rarely dares to stare it in the face. This is the story Henry VIII wanted the world to forget, the death of a brother who was never meant to be a criminal, but a tool. Picture it, May 17, 1536. The Tower of London breathes like a living creature. Cold stone, iron bars, the smell of damp straw and fear clinging to every inch of its skin. A young man walks toward the scaffold, handsome, brilliant, a poet, a courtier. Anne Boleyn's own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. He does not tremble. He does not cry. But his eyes burn with something deeper than terror, betrayal. He knows the truth. He knows that he is not dying because he broke the law. He is dying because someone needed him dead. Because to destroy Anne Boleyn, to erase Henry's shame, to rewrite a marriage as a curse instead of a choice, Henry VIII needed a monster. And when no monster existed, he created one. A brother accused of sleeping with his own sister. A man condemned not for what he did, but for what his death could achieve. But here's the question that history has never answered. Why George? Why a charge so obscene that even enemies of the Boleyns recoiled at it? Why did Thomas Boleyn, the father who had raised his children to shine, stand silent while both were dragged to execution? And perhaps the darkest question of all, if George Boleyn had lived, would Anne Boleyn have died? Because the truth, the terrible truth, is that George's execution wasn't collateral damage. It was a strategy. An indispensable sacrifice. The king's final weapon. Before we uncover that truth, before we peel back the lies and stare directly into the political machine that murdered the Boleyns, I want to ask you, are you ready to see the Tudor court not as a place of romance and ambition, but as a slaughterhouse built on the bones of the innocent? If you are, like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns, where we resurrect the voices history tried to bury. Because tonight, George Boleyn will speak. We think of George Boleyn as an accessory, Anne Boleyn's brother, a man swept away by her downfall. But that version is a lie, a soothing lie that protects the real villains. Because George was not collateral, he was the key. Henry VIII needed Anne to fall. He needed her death to look inevitable, not like the impulsive rage of a king who had grown tired of a wife he once destroyed a continent for. Anne could not simply be executed, no, she had to be discredited. Her reputation was annihilated, her image twisted beyond repair. Henry VIII needed England to believe that the woman he had defied Rome for, the woman he had crowned, worshipped, and torn his kingdom apart for, had deceived him. And worse, humiliated him. How do you humiliate a king? You accuse his wife of the one betrayal that strikes at the heart of male pride, sex. But adultery was not enough. Anyone could commit adultery. Anyone could be seduced. To destroy Anne completely, Henry needed something unthinkable. Something that would turn public sympathy into disgust. Something that would make her death not only acceptable, but necessary. Incest. If Anne slept with her own brother, she was not a tragic queen. She was a monster. And if she was a monster, Henry was not a brute for killing her. He was a hero for protecting England. That was the paradox. That was the narrative. And George's life was the price. What happened in those weeks of May 1536 did not just take down a queen. It changed the religious future of England. It reshaped the Tudor dynasty. It set Henry VIII on the path toward tyranny. Anne Boleyn's death gave Henry license. George Boleyn's death validated it. But it also exposed something far darker. The Tudor court had become a place where evidence did not matter, truth did not matter, justice did not matter. All that mattered was the king's desire. And once the king discovered that he could destroy anyone, even a man of noble birth, even a family he had once loved, with a whisper and a signature, there was no turning back. The entire kingdom learned a lesson that day. No one was safe. Not queens, not courtiers, not families who had sacrificed everything to lift Henry higher. In killing George Boleyn, Henry VIII learned that he could kill anyone. And he did. George Boleyn did not begin life as a criminal, or a joke, or a pawn. He began as a star. Brilliant, charismatic, astonishingly educated, a man fluent in multiple languages, a poet whose verses echoed through the noble courts of Europe, a diplomat trusted by kings, and the dazzling brother of the woman who captivated Henry VIII. George was not a shadow of his sister. He was a force in his own right. But the Tudor court has a way of turning brilliance into danger, and the brighter the Boleyn siblings shone, the more powerful enemies they created. Was it ambition, jealousy, fear? Or was it something uglier? The simple fact that in Henry VIII's kingdom, no family was meant to shine brighter than the crown. At first, George's rising star seemed harmless. He was witty, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to speak in metaphors that brushed dangerously close to open criticism. He debated religion with clerics, mocked the king's old-fashioned counselors, and wrote poetry that teased the boundaries of propriety. But most of all, he adored his sister Anne. Their bond was deep, unusual for the era, two siblings bound not just by love, but by shared destiny. Where Anne went, George followed. Where George succeeded, Anne celebrated. Their futures were intertwined, their victories mutual, their downfall inevitable. Together, they became something the Tudor court feared: a united front, a powerful alliance, a family stronger than the king's ego could tolerate. And so the whispers began. It started subtly. A joke here, a raised eyebrow there, a comment muttered behind a goblet of wine. George spends too much time with Anne. He speaks too freely with the Queen. They have no sense of boundaries. Of course, it wasn't true, but truth was never necessary. Whispers do not need evidence. They need oxygen. And the Tudor court was full of it. Every time George defended Anne's reforms, every time he pushed for religious changes that angered the conservatives, every time he stood by her side against the factions seeking to restore Catherine of Aragon, he made enemies. Enemies who understood something Henry VIII had not yet admitted. If Anne was to fall, George must fall with her. They were two halves of one threat. The court wanted them destroyed. They merely waited for the king to want it too. Anne's marriage to Henry VIII had begun as a firestorm. Passion, obsession, a love affair that rewrote the laws of Europe and severed ties with Rome. But passion is a dangerous foundation for power. Fire warms, fire illuminates, fire destroys. By 1536, the fire had turned on Anne. She had failed to give Henry the one thing he believed would grant him immortality, a living son. And now Henry felt deceived. He felt cursed. He felt mocked. All the sacrifices he had made, the wives abandoned, the friendships destroyed, the church uprooted, suddenly looked like mistakes. And Henry VIII had never forgiven himself for mistakes. Instead, he punished the people who reminded him of them. Anne became a reminder. George became a reminder. The entire Boleyn family became a reminder. Henry needed to rewrite his own narrative, to paint himself not as a man who followed lust into chaos, but as a man who had been wronged. He needed a villain. He needed an excuse. He needed Anne Boleyn to be a liar, a seductress, a traitor. And for that to work, he needed George to be something worse. A tragedy rarely destroys everyone equally. There is always one person who escapes, one person who chooses survival over loyalty. In the fall of the Boleyns, that person was Thomas Boleyn. He had been the architect of his children's rise, pushing Anne toward the king, encouraging George's political career, fueling the family's ascent to unmatched influence. But when danger came, Thomas Boleyn became something else, a survivor, a pragmatist, a man who watched his own children drown and refused to throw a rope. While Anne and George were arrested, Thomas stayed silent. He did not speak in their defense. He did not plead for mercy. He did not risk himself. Instead, he waited. He calculated. He aligned himself with Cromwell and the conservative factions. He distanced himself from his own blood. Historians sometimes try to soften his betrayal. They say he had no power. They say he was helpless. But silence is its own decision. And in a world where the king's will shaped destiny, one voice mattered more than all others, a father's voice. Thomas Boleyn chose to live. Anne and George paid the price. Let's state the truth plainly. The charge of incest was impossible, not improbable, not unlikely, impossible. Even Eustace Chapwis, Catherine of Aragon's ambassador, a man who despised Anne, admitted that the case was fabricated. He wrote, "The proofs are nothing, the accusations invented." So why use such a grotesque accusation? Why not settle for adultery? Why not treason? Why not the simple charge of plotting against the king? Because adultery wounds the king's pride. Incest annihilates it. A wife who commits adultery is a sinner. A wife who sleeps with her brother is a monster. A husband deceived by adultery is unfortunate. A husband deceived by incest is a fool. And Henry VIII could never be a fool. So someone else had to be. George Boleyn became the shield that protected Henry's ego and the sword that severed Anne's head. By accusing George, Cromwell created the perfect narrative. Anne had not failed to produce a son because fate was cruel. She had failed because she was wicked. Her bloodline was corrupt. Her womb is a curse. Her children are unholy. No queen like that could stand. No queen like that could be pitied. No queen like that could be mourned. The charge of incest did not convict George, it convicted Anne. And Henry VIII accepted it because it gave him exactly what he needed, a reason. The trial of George Boleyn was not a legal proceeding. It was theater, a spectacle, a ritual sacrifice. The courtroom overflowed with nobles, their faces tight with anticipation, eager not for justice, but for blood. George stood tall. He spoke clearly, confidently. He refused to crumble. He challenged the evidence. He mocked the inconsistencies. He exposed the absurdity. At one moment, he even laughed, a sharp, bitter laugh that cut through the hall like broken glass. But the verdict had been written long before he entered the room. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Not because he was, but because he had to be. A guilty brother meant a guilty queen. A guilty queen meant a justified king. Every decision, every lie, every whisper led to one conclusion. George Boleyn had to die so that Henry VIII could live with himself. When the sentence was read, George's eyes did not flinch. He knew the truth. He had always known the truth. He was dying not as a man, but as a message. A message to Anne, you will not escape. A message to England, the king cannot be questioned. A message to Cromwell's enemies, this is what happens to those who stand in the way. George was not executed for a crime. He was executed for convenience. Kings do not kill tools because they break. They kill tools when they are no longer useful. And George had served his purpose. His death would cleanly sever Anne's final thread of support. His death would erase sympathy. His death would satisfy the hunger for scandal. The Tudor court feasted on the ruin of one of its brightest sons, and the man who had once dazzled Europe was reduced to a cautionary tale. A warning carved in the shadow of the scaffold. Do not shine brighter than the king. Do not stand too close to a falling queen. Do not believe that loyalty will save you. It won't. Thomas Boleyn did not attend the executions. He did not visit the Tower. He did not ask questions. He retreated to Hever Castle, the home he had filled with ambition and emptied with fear. Some say he prayed. Some say he drank. Some say he simply stared at the walls that once echoed with the laughter of the children he had lost. But the truth is crueler. Thomas Boleyn survived. Anne and George did not. What does a man do when survival is the only legacy he has left? What does a father feel when the price of his ambition is the blood of his children? Thomas never said. His silence is the loudest confession of all. Henry VIII's role in George's death often hides behind Cromwell, behind the trial, behind the spectacle. But Henry was the architect, the destroyer, the man whose ego demanded a story that erased guilt. And what story could erase guilt better than the tale of a king betrayed by a wife and her own brother? Henry VIII killed George because he needed a narrative that made Anne's death inevitable. Kings do not like to appear wrong. Kings do not like to appear impulsive. Kings do not like to appear cruel. But kings will destroy a family to avoid appearing foolish. George Boleyn became the sacrifice that kept Henry VIII's pride intact. He became the lie the king needed to sleep at night. On May 17th, George walked to his death with a dignity that shamed the court. He gave one of the most extraordinary final speeches in Tudor history, calm, eloquent, honest. He admitted no sin. He asked forgiveness for none. He thanked God for his faith. And he warned England, "Judge not, lest you be judged." He had been forced into the role of a monster, but he refused to die as one. When the sword fell, it did more than end a life. It ended an era. It ended a family. It ended the illusion that Henry VIII's kingdom was built on anything other than fear. The day after George Boleyn's execution, the Tower of London felt heavier, darker, as if grief itself had soaked into the stones. Anne Boleyn was told of her brother's death while she waited for her own. Witnesses swore her face went pale, that her breath caught, that the one thing finally capable of breaking her spirit was not the sword meant for her, but the knowledge that her brother had died because of her. Not for what she did, but for what she symbolized, for standing too close to a king's fragile pride. George's death was not merely the prelude to Anne's. It was the psychological weapon that destroyed her before the executioner ever lifted his blade. She died knowing the truth. Her brother had been murdered to justify murdering her. No queen in England's history suffered a more calculated erasure. After the scaffold was dismantled and the crowds disappeared, a strange silence swept England. The Boleyns, who just months before had been the center of the kingdom, vanished overnight. Their allies retreated. Their enemies celebrated. Their father hid. George's wife, Jane Parker, played her own deadly role in the dramas to come, eventually dying on a scaffold herself, condemned for helping Catherine Howard commit adultery. It was as if the curse of May 1536 spread outward like poison, touching every life connected to the family. But the one person who could not escape it was Henry VIII, because the truth Henry tried hardest to bury, was that George Boleyn's ghost never left him. Every time Henry looked at Jane Seymour, he saw the woman Anne could never be. Every time he looked at Elizabeth, he saw the daughter of the woman he destroyed. Every time he passed the Tower, he saw the ghosts of two siblings who had never truly betrayed him. Kings can command armies, but they cannot command memory, and Henry VIII remembered. He remembered George's calm voice condemning no one. He remembered the elegance, the intelligence, the loyalty that George had shown more consistently than the king deserved. And in the dark, when the palace grew silent, when the torches flickered low, when guilt crept in like smoke, Henry would feel it again, that faint sting of shame, the shame of a man who killed a brother because he could not bear to kill the truth.
George Boleyn never produced an heir. He left no children, no great estates, no line to continue his name. But he left something far more powerful, a warning. His death became a symbol of how far a king, even one anointed by God, will go to protect his ego. In the centuries after his execution, scholars uncovered the truth. The testimonies were fabricated, the witnesses coerced, the charges impossible. The man accused of incest was instead a man of intellect, courage, and terrifying political usefulness. History eventually restored the truth, but too late to save the man whose neck met the sword. And so George's legacy became a paradox. He died because of a lie. He is remembered because of the truth. Now that we have peeled away the myth, exposed the whispers, and confronted the brutality of Tudor politics, we must ask the question history has tried hardest to avoid. Was George Boleyn's death necessary for Anne Boleyn's? Did the king truly believe the charges, or did he need a brother's blood to stain Anne beyond redemption? And darker still, if George had fled, if he had betrayed Anne, if he had saved himself, would the queen have lived? Or was the entire family doomed the moment Henry VIII desired another woman? These are not questions with easy answers, because the Tudor world was not a world of justice, it was a world of survival, and survival often demands cruelty. George Boleyn died as a tool, a symbol, a weapon, but his death forces us to confront a brutal truth. Power is never satisfied. It always demands a body, and the closer you stand to the throne, the more likely that body will be yours. Kings are remembered for their victories, but dynasties endure because of their sacrifices, and sometimes those sacrifices are human lives. George Boleyn's fall teaches us one final haunting lesson. The greatest danger in a royal court is not treason, but proximity. Was George Boleyn a victim of politics, or a victim of Henry VIII's fear of looking weak? Was his death the byproduct of a queen's fall, or the keystone that made it possible? And perhaps the most chilling question, if a king can invent a crime to justify an execution, does truth matter at all, or does power create its own reality? If this story forced you to see the Boleyn tragedy in a new light, tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns, where we reveal the truths that monarchs tried to bury. Because behind every execution is a story the crown hoped you would never hear. Behind every myth is a person, and behind every person is a ghost still waiting to speak.